Hi, and welcome back to the NCS Podcast Current Series. This is Lauren Koffman. I'm a neurointensivist at Temple University in Philadelphia. And today I'd like to welcome onto the podcast authors from a recent Currents article, Consent for Brain Death Determination. The Ends Justify the Means, or does it not? So today I'd like to welcome Drs. Clotilde Balucani, who is a neurointensivist at NYU Langone, and Dr. Julia Durrant, who's a neurointensivist at Oregon Health and Science University. Thank you both for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
So before we kind of get into some of the specifics of what you write about in the article, I think it'd be interesting for our listeners to hear a little bit about your background and kind of how you became interested in this topic and what your experiences is within the realm of kind of ethics and brain death.
All right, I can start. So my name is, as you said, Clotilde Balucani. I'm a neurologist, a neurointensivist, and also a clinical researcher. I'm currently work at Bellevue Hospital in New York City, which is affiliated with NYU School of Medicine. And I had the privilege of being a member of the ethics committee at the Bellevue Hospital and also serving the Organ Donation Council. I'd say that my commitment to ethics started really from day one of my medical career with the Hippocratic Oath. I believe really ethics and the practice of medicine are more than intertwined. And an ethical framework is indispensable for every single decision we make as physicians. And I think it's particularly true in an environment like the neurointensive care unit, constantly facing catastrophic brain injuries, risks and benefits discussion of treatments that cannot necessarily guarantee favorable outcomes. So I encourage everyone to really have a very solid ethics background because it will serve for life.
Great. And I'm Julia Durrant. As I mentioned, I work as a neurointensivist at Oregon Health Science University. I work on our organ donation committee, so I head that up. I'm also in charge of overseeing all of our policies for donation and declaration of death. And so I have very much an interest in that. I also am a part of the Neuro Critical Care Society's Ethics Committee. I've been a part of that for the last 2 years, and I really have a lot of interest in how we communicate with families at the end of life, particularly how we make decisions together in a way that honors their views as well as their family's views, and is something that is an ethical, acceptable ethical outcome for the providers as well.
Great. Thank you so much for telling us a little bit about yourselves. So before we get into the nitty gritty of, the new guidelines and what things we kind of need to discuss, can you just talk a little bit about some of the challenges historically that have kind of occurred within the sphere of consent and brain death testing?
Yeah, sure. So whether to seek consent, particularly in apnea testing, has been hotly debated in the neurocritical world and in our legal world as well over the last couple of decades. There's been several, I call them high profile because I think they're high profile to the neurocritical care world, but there's been at least a half dozen lawsuits, particularly concerning pediatric patients where there's a overlap between parents' rights to make decision, and that can come into conflict with various hospital systems when they are trying to determine death. There have been states like Montana and California that have ruled that consent is required, and other states like New York and Texas and Virginia that have ruled that consent is not required. So the legality of this is quite varied across the United States. On the other hand, physicians and other care providers in the past, even recently as I think it was 2020, that's in our article here, have indicated via different surveys that they don't believe that consent is required to do brain death. And so because consent isn't required to declare circulatory death, and these are equivalent. So the 2023 guidelines support physicians in that decision there.
Great. And before I really delve into the specifics of the ethical ramifications of whether we need to consider doing this or not, I think it's important to just remind our listeners about the concept of autonomy and how that kind of fits into whether we need to consider the process of informed consent when it comes to brain death testing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I want to make a very important premise here. So the ethical foundation of informed consent rests on respect for autonomy or self-determination. So fundamentally, informed consent, by providing individuals with the necessary knowledge, allows them to really define their own goals and to make choices designed to achieve those goals. So very few exceptions exist for the requirement of informed consent. And all of these exceptions are founded on the ethical principle of beneficence and non-maleficence. It is believed and assumed that the proposed treatment will preserve life and therefore should be pursued in the absence of consent. So it's important to understand that preservation of life is assumed to be the physician's default mode when consent cannot be obtained or is withheld. Withholding consent for brain death testing does not really align with this. The other point I want to make is that typically, when there is no alternative, consent is meaningless. So let's think about cardiocirculatory death. It does not need consent. There is no alternative to it. In contrast, before undertaking the test to confirm brain death, there are actually other options to choose from. And this is the fundamental difference between traditional death by circulatory arrest and brain death. So when options exist, shared decision-making is essential. And so patients facing imminent brain death have indeed the option, other than undergoing brain death testing, such as withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment, for example, with the transition to comfort care, as well as potentially donation after circulatory death. And so, in other words, the traditional framework that we use for cardiocirculatory death does not necessarily apply in brain death testing. And therefore, the fact that consent is not needed is not necessarily true here. The other point I would like to make is that, differently from the case of cardiac death, the patient prior to brain death testing confirmation is still actually alive. It is just assumed to be dead. So, and is or she receiving life-supporting treatments. Therefore, withholding consent to determine whether his or her is dead by neurological criteria, it means that we are assuming the patient has already turned into a corpse with no autonomy prior to the test, ante-mortem. So, further, brain death testing, specifically the apnea test, is actually a risky and non-therapeutic test. Even if the safety of apnea test has improved significantly, it is not zero. And we are aware that major complications of the apnea test include hemodynamic instability leading to fatal cardiac arrest. The measure by which the induced hypercapnia could precipitate brain death itself, it is absolutely underestimated, and it's going to be very difficult to be studied. Not only we are assuming, therefore, that the patient is already a corpse deprived of self-determination, but we are also increasing the chances of brain death to occur. So it really should not be the degree, the magnitude of the risk, rather than the principle. So the fact that there is a risk that should inspire our decision whether withholding informed consent or not. Therefore, the argument that apnea test is relatively a safe test is not really acceptable. Unfortunately, this topic is quickly dismissed in the current and prior guidelines.
Yeah, so you just actually kind of preempted what my next question is going to be, and I feel like I know how you're going to answer based on what you just talked about. But the 2023 guidelines, which everyone was very anxiously awaiting, which came out last year, states that informed consent is not necessary to proceed with brain death testing. So are you saying that you disagree? And if so, can you explain a little bit more why?
Absolutely. So unfortunately, I can't provide a straight answer here. I can only recognize that the issue of informed consent for brain death has created in me some sort of cognitive dissonance. On one end, I can only agree with the tremendous need for organs and that the availability of organs saves lives. I can only agree that efforts should be made in directing care towards those most likely to benefit from it. There is no question these are healthcare priorities. However, I can't agree with an approach that overrules individuals' autonomy, even considering the noble principle of distributive justice that I just explained. So I don't think it's the right answer to this complex problem just to withhold informed consent. In an ideal world, I'd envision locally, statewide, and nationally educational campaign to be pursued to inform the public about brain death, why this construct actually has been developed, how brain death is determined, and what are the risks and the implications for healthcare resources, for organ donation, and for the patient. So I'm actually really confident that this knowledge is a more ethical way to resolve a complex problem. Investing in these public campaigns is what I really envision and I would agree with. I disagree with dismissing the need for informed consent and the justifications that have been provided so far, including the fact that most neurologists don't think is required, as emerged by some surveys. The end really doesn't justify the means. I think rather than an utilitarian approach, we need a more ethical, shared, and transparent decision process for the determination of brain death.
Okay, and so now playing devil's advocate, how would you respond to people that would say, if we were to require blanket informed consent before proceeding with brain death testing, that could put a huge strain on the healthcare system? You alluded to the fact that there are implications for organ donation and transplantation, but it goes beyond that into just resource allocation for patients that may require prolonged organ support, like several extra days in the ICU, which are keeping beds full for otherwise patients that really truly could benefit from our care. So how would you respond to that?
I don't think it's going to be affecting the majority of our patients. I think the majority of our patients and our families trust us, and they have put their trust in what we are recommending to do. And so when we have conversations with them and start describing these devastating neurological injuries and that we're not seeing any kind of evidence of brain function, I think most families accept this. And, us asking for informed consent to do additional testing to confirm that this process has happened and that their loved one has passed, I don't think most are going to disagree with it. I think those that disagree with it are already disagreeing with it. And so it's those situations where I think we have the most to lose by forcing families to have these decisions. Those are the situations where our families and our society in general lose trust in us and the care that we're providing for them. So if we are forcing them to accept this declaration of death and forcing them to accept this test that they feel has risk without providing alternatives to them, I think that's actually the detriment to our relationship with our families. So I think it really is going to be a small number, and I think those that are going to be bothered by it already are bothered.
One point that I was curious to get your opinion on is in your current article, you mentioned, or suggested the possibility of when there's a challenging situation, reaching out for an ethics consultation within your hospital system. I've been fortunate enough to work at facilities where we do have that available, but I imagine not everyone has that resource available to them within their own institution. So do you have any suggestions or other alternative resources that you could share with our listeners for people that don't have access to an ethics consult if they were to be in one of these tough situations?
So actually, this is a very interesting question. And I want to just remind that, the Joint Commission on Accreditation of Healthcare Organization actually requires hospitals to have a mechanisms for addressing ethical issues and providing patient care. And it recommends the existence of a multidisciplinary ethics committee. And obviously, it does not provide a further indication on how to develop and implement that. But there has been some literature suggesting exploring the existence of ethics committee in hospitals. And it has been suggested that at least above 90%, almost 97% of US hospitals have actually healthcare ethics programs. Obviously, some hospitals will still remain without this availability. And what I can just suggest is to maybe develop ad hoc committee that should include different, perspective and representatives, for example, patient and community representatives, as well as nurses from various specialties and physicians from various specialties, administrators, attorneys, and even, clergy and social workers, of course. These are typically the members that actually compose the ethics committee and may guarantee that and the conflict, is approached in a holistic way, looking at different perspectives.
Okay, now we've been talking a lot about this as more of an abstract concept. So I was wondering if one of you could maybe just briefly describe a challenging case that would maybe encapsulates these topics that we've been discussing.
I haven't had families specifically decline apnea testing, but I've certainly had families who have disagreed with brain death as a overall construct and a disease state or state of being at this point. So I can recall a particularly fraught family meeting that I had with a family who was very upset with how their loved one had declined, and the fact that I was saying that this patient was now brain dead was very, very emotional to them. It was an hour-long conversation where the family basically yelled at us for, forcing them to declare him dead, and that they disagreed with that. And so it took a lot of emotional consideration of the family, sitting with the family, sitting in this agonizing space and, allowing them to verbalize all of this emotion in order for them to process that. And at the end of the conversation, I allowed them to talk for a very long time. And at the end of the conversation, I invited them to come into the room and be there when I was doing the examination so that I could demonstrate exactly what I was seeing. And then I also invited them to participate with us in the apnea exam, which I do with all of my patients, but I really spent a lot of time talking to them of exactly what I was fearing had happened to their loved one. And I have very few families who at the end of that 10 minutes don't grasp this idea that it's been 10 minutes and their loved one has not tried to take a breath that entire time. And at that point, they do usually tend to say, this is the end. But it was one of those times when, I was very much aware that the test that I was doing with this apnea test in this particular patient could have been quite hemodynamically unstable. And if that particular patient had undergone cardiac arrest during that time, that would have been even more fraught with this relationship that I was developing with the family. So it was something that had I actually pursued informed consent at that point, I might have felt a little bit more protected myself, because then the family would know all of those risks related to it, rather than escalating more when if something were to happen and arrest were to occur at that point.
I mean, you brought up an excellent point. I'm a huge advocate for having the family at bedside when I'm doing this testing because, we have actual evidence to show that it does improve their comprehension of the concept of brain death and even process things. So that's a great point. Thank you. I guess we just had these guideline updates come out recently and these things don't happen often. So do you foresee any changes in the future that might, put emphasis or consideration for informed consent within the process?
I think it's probably going to require more changes to our legal landscape before those changes happen in our medical literature and our medical guidelines.
And I think from the research perspective, I think more effort should be really spent to understand what is, the knowledge of the public on this topic and what are their opinions. So I think knowing their perspective is going to be really important to inform any further change of guidelines. I think we're really missing their perspective.
So finally, my last question will be, are there any references you'd recommend for someone that wants to learn more? And I know you mentioned some being active within the ethics committee, within NCS. I'm not sure if there's any opportunities there for people to join, but I'd love for you to share how our members and listeners can learn more, be more active within ethics in neurocritical care.
Certainly, you know, we get new members in the ethics committee, I think every, you know, with the new annual meeting. So they'll be sending out applications to join different committees. And so please sign up for them. We have robust conversations every month concerning different ethical principles. And we also discuss different ethical conundrums that come up in our practice as well. So it's a great opportunity to get a perspective from a bunch of different people who are working in, you know, rural centers and academic centers. We have nurses there as well as part of our group. So it really is a great way to get a lot of different perspectives.
Thank you for joining. We really appreciate both of your perspectives and for chatting more about this. We'll make sure we include a link to the article in the show notes. To check out this or other Currents content, head to currents.neurocriticalcare.org. And as a reminder, NCS offers free CME for select podcasts. Just listen via the NCS Learning Center and complete a short survey to receive your credits. Make sure you bookmark us so you never miss an episode.
Thank you.
Thank you.